The Brazilian was caught between Ukrainians and Russians, and it was the Russians who sent him on assaults to end the lives of the Ukrainians who were defending the forest near Sebrianka. There, shots from the trenches tried to stop his advance. They were shots from aftermath Kalashnikova rifles, M4S, and whatever else Kiev had to stop Moscow's advance. The kamikazes flew toward the Brazilian. He watched his comrades die. The weight of his choices almost made him drown in a sea of despair, but faith kept his spirit high, even in the hell that man created on earth. The conflicts in Ukraine impacted the world economically and politically. Over time, news of a distant war started to feel closer, as the media constantly reported the deaths of Brazilians who were involved in the conflict. On Ukraine's side, dozens of them died fighting for the International Legion. It took a while for the same thing to start happening on the Russian side. The truth was that over time, the Russian armed forces developed a model in which rewards and promises for foreigners fighting in Putin's war became increasingly greater. High salaries, bonuses, citizenship, there was even more. Helping with this, there was no shortage of Brazilian influencers spreading news that Ukraine had already lost the war, as if the battles were easy. On the Russian side, it was just a walk on the front lines, where Russian bombs did the work against Ukrainian troops.
You have somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million dead.
Russia, it will never lose.
Do you feel the subtlety of what I'm about to say here? If Russia faces the gang, it will tie with the world.
I'm going to say something you don't want to hear, I know, but look, you're going to have to accept it. Russia won the war.
This, combined with the propaganda of high salaries as well as some scams, started to attract the attention of young people like Vitor Loyan Nunes de Souza. He learned about the conflict early on. The algorithm and influencers helped shape his knowledge about the war, portraying the Russian side as easy to fight for. The hope of helping his family, of transforming everyone's life with high promises, warmed his heart and fueled an idea that grew over the months. By the time he made his decision, there were already other Brazilians there fighting in the name of Putin's flag. Some of them were telling the truth. Yes, there were sincere people talking about the risks, but their voices were much less heard. Talking about the risks didn't get engagement, only talking about Russian victories did. Even so, they talked about what the war was really like. But by then, the social media algorithm and the hopeful voices of some influencers had already won over Victor's heart. He longed for the military experience, and the promise of good salaries gave him hope to change his family's living conditions. At 24 years old, he sold everything he had, saved up 5,000 reais, and bought a one-way ticket to Russia. The original plan was to stay abroad for a short time to provide financial support to his family and then return to Brazil. They were normal dreams of a young man hoping to change his life with a salary. That was what was promised. Like a war between one of the world's largest armies and outdated, unmotivated armed forces that only lost territory and never won anything. There were never any videos from these influencers showing deaths in the Russian armed forces, and the algorithm didn't deliver that kind of information. Further confirming Victor's belief, even though he had never been in the military, Victor arrived in Russia via Qatar and had to stay in a church while waiting to be enlisted. He signed a contract in Russian, trusting what he was promised and without being able to do any kind of translation. Later, he would say that the promise they made to him was the same as always, a support position at the front. Soon after, the drastic change in his life began, when fate, having already placed him in the arms of war, let go of his hand to leave him, under the tutelage of masters, like death, tragedy, and conflict. He joined the 7th Independent Motorized Rifle Brigade, a unit formed at the beginning of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. In 2014, Moscow started arming and funding separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk. In 2022, the brigade officially became part of the Russian Armed Forces, and the 4th Infantry Battalion was created. According to his family, Victor had a crash course of just 2 weeks before facing the front line. During that time, he met several foreigners, including a Chinese man called Baby, and prepared for combat with Colombians, Argentinians, and Cubans. But 2 weeks, a year, or even 2 years wouldn't be enough to prepare anyone for the horror of that war. Neither the Brazilian nor so many others were prepared for what it was, a Russian assault squad on the front lines in Ukraine. Vitor didn't say where he was, but the 7th Motorized Rifle Brigade was fighting in Sebrianka, aiming to reach Siversk. There, the Ukrainians were struggling to defend themselves against the Russian advances. What Vitor would find was a war zone in an advanced state of destruction. The trees broken by the conflict no longer hid the ground scorched by bombs or the carcasses of equipment destroyed by drones. Nature was withering away, replaced by the scar left by the Russian advance. The trenches were exposed like arteries in the scorched earth, bathed in Russian and Ukrainian blood. Metallic shapes were lost among the fallen trees and the dry trunks that still stood. The light from the sky pierced the mist, illuminating the corpses of soldiers who would probably never have a funeral. There were dozens of them lying in the ditches where they had jumped during the assaults or in the shelters that did little against the bombs. Some bodies barely retained a human shape, twisted by the force of the impacts or already consumed by decomposition. Weapons, uniforms, and radios were slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Indifferent to the discarded human lives, but ready to reclaim everything as soon as men abandoned some parts. There was still jungle, where the soldiers tried to take cover, hoping the drones wouldn't detect them. In the middle of the forest, the trenches were constantly harassed by Moscow's forces, with bullets whizzing through the trees, triggers being pulled until entire magazines were emptied at the Russians trying to advance. It was shoot and hide in the trench to buy time. Russian bombs were falling on villages and on the forest. The heavy shells released a heat that consumed the trees, searing between the trunks until it reached the Ukrainians. Faced with such destruction, the defenders often had to retreat, seeking new cover or simply abandoning the area. The multiple rocket launchers also gave no respite. Dozens of projectiles were fired at the Russian equipment, spreading destruction across the entire battlefield. Vitor arrived at the front line, joining the assault groups in August when he was already in position. The Russians launched a mechanized assault on Sebrianka. The first armored vehicles were stopped by drones, some suffering catastrophic explosions that wiped out the entire crew. The smoldering remains served as a warning to the Russian forces approaching the area, which was defended by the 81st Airborne Brigade deployed from Ukraine. A motorcycle platoon advanced, joining the attack. Suddenly, the leader of the formation was hit by a drone, instantly disappearing in a cloud of smoke and debris. Others met the same fate, creating a trail of corpses and dead bodies on the road. Right behind them, the tank that was giving them cover was mercilessly consumed by the swarm of drones. The kamikazes of the 81st Brigade were lethal against the Russian armored vehicles, immobilizing many of them before they could enter Sebrianka. Vider took part in several offensives during that time. He reported how the Chinese man Baby, the Argentine Eloy, and 5 other Latinos went into combat. There were several assaults by different squads on that dangerous front still during the months of August and September. One of them was a nighttime attack with motorcycles whose headlights attracted the enemy's attention. When the soldiers got off the vehicles to start the incursion, the drones were already in position, dropping explosives on the Russian troops. The first soldiers fell in front of the Ukrainian trenches. Others tried to escape in a painful walk through the darkness, but explosives rained down on them. With surgical precision, the shockwave shattered their legs, first voraciously climbing up the body until it extinguished any trace of life. The drones, equipped with thermal cameras, detected the heat from the soldiers' bodies and their motorcycles hidden under the trees. They dropped 2 explosives to secure the target, and the third made the Russian soldier roll for the last time. Kamikaze drones began detonating over the other soldiers in a different area of the assault. Men who had followed on foot, wrapped in cloaks designed to hide thermal signatures, but without success. The munitions dropped by the drones kept lighting up the night and ending the lives of Putin's soldiers until the attack lost momentum and the wounded had to flee. In one of those assaults, Victor saw each of his comrades begin to disappear. Amid the explosions, Baby was hit by a kamikaze. To the Brazilian's horror, his friend remained alive, with his legs torn off, bleeding little due to the cauterization of the wounds. The Chinese man looked desperately at Victor, begging for death. Nothing prepares a person for that sight. Horror was written all over Victor's face, sweat was running down his body, and the adrenaline made his hands tremble. His finger was close to the trigger, but it didn't move. There was nothing in his heart that would drive him to do something like that, to execute a person like this. The buzzing of the drones snapped him out of his stupor. The kamikazes dove around him, bringing more screams to the battlefield. An explosion sent shrapnel against his legs. He moved with difficulty, the need to survive and his faith carrying him upward, away from death. His mind was flooded with flashes of memories of Baby and her desperate plea for mercy. Vida survived, but the innocence that brought him there did not. The drones continued the hunt through the forest, flying between the trees, their lenses observing the fallen bodies and searching for the wounded. To eliminate any risk of a soldier returning to the front and helping to carry out Putin's plans, the Russians kept blowing up the Ukrainian positions. Any identified defense became the target of more strikes, one after another, always analyzing enemy movements to clear the way for the assault troops. The Russian TOS-1A launched a rocket salvo over the forest defended by Kiev. The 24 shots in less than 12 seconds projected the threat to just over 10 kili. As each rocket landed among the trees, a small charge broke its casing, immediately dispersing a cloud of highly flammable chemical aerosol that penetrated every crack, hole, and gap in the forest. Fractions of a second later, when the second charge detonated this saturated mist, a fireball was created, with temperatures between 2,500 degrees Celsius and 3,000 degrees Celsius. The shockwave, instead of being held back by the trunks, flowed devastatingly around them. At the epicenter of the explosion, the forest was instantly flattened, with trees not only charred but split in half or uprooted. Due to the violence of the extreme overpressure, the forest, devastated by the rockets, offered little protection to the Ukrainians, who were shattered in body and soul by the impacts. They knew drones and assault teams would follow. Often it was better to move to defensible positions, giving up ground to the Russian advance, but saving the soldiers' lives. Victor didn't know. But the voices of other Brazilians were on the opposite side, taking the hits from the RPGs and trying to survive the same way through the violence of the war they chose. These men had to endure the constant advances of the Russians, harassing their defenses. Every shot was a test. With luck, there were Babiad and Ukrainian drones over the enemy assault groups, dropping multiple explosives at once. Some of these attacks were contained, even forcing some of the enemies to surrender. The Russian counterattack against the Baba Yaga consisted of launching kamikazes to take down these Ukrainian aerial threats. Vitor often found the remains of these mechanical demons, collecting their pieces by order of his leaders. As she recovered from the fighting, she gradually adjusted to the horrors of war. Even living in hell, she wore a smile on her face and took some photos when she had internet access, posting parts of her routine. She held on to faith and hope, even as she saw friends leaving or being mutilated. She had to be resilient, holding back despair and keeping a strong structure in her heart so she wouldn't go insane. After the despair and initial shock, she stood firm in her decisions. Her mission now was to survive in that environment and return to her family. Ukrainian drones hunted the Russians in the field. Whether they were assault troops or men defending positions, they searched for Moscow's soldiers. Hidden among the trees, in houses, trenches, or in the remains of destroyed equipment. Victor received this news in his daily life. Stories of failed assaults were frequent. It was no wonder that from June to September, in 3 months, the 4th Battalion managed to cover only 4 kilometers. But of course, there were also successful missions where the bodies of comrades were left behind, but trenches were taken. He still tried to keep his spirits up. The family asked for support in Brazil, sending messages expressing love and prayers for him. In September, the Russians launched new assaults in the region, which was defended by the 81st and 54th Brigades. The armored vehicles withstood the emitter drones, exploded along the way, and their protective grills managed to keep most of them intact. Some soldiers disembarked under dry trees, and the tanks fired at the Ukrainian defenses. The armored vehicles were still resisting what the kamikazes were throwing at them: music. But there was a limit that soon stopped the war machine. The crew found themselves prey to the kamikazes, perishing in the field. These explosions were seen by a group of Russians who tried a new attack with motorcycles. It was a difficult path on an open and damaged road, making them easy targets. They zigzagged along the road while the smoke from the explosions obscured the view of the men who watched their comrades being hit. Some dismounted, trying to find new cover when the terrain no longer allowed them to continue with the motorcycles, but there was no escape. There was no shelter that could save them from the deadly hunt coming from the sky. Other Brazilians reported Victor as missing around this time, between September and October of 2025. Without any news, the family became desperate. Hope kept their hearts in a state of suffering and victory, vigilance, waiting for news from a dangerous front. The courage with which he faced his own decisions, keeping a smile even in the worst moments, left many people in awe. With the resilience of someone who has witnessed the worst that a human being can do to another, the Russians continued bombing the region, and by all indications, they managed to take Sebrianka in December 2025. By then, Victor had stopped responding to messages. Siversk nearby also fell during this time. A veteran reportedly said that Victor died in combat and was buried in Ukraine, without the chance for a wake, without the chance to say goodbye, without his parents even being able to visit where their son would be buried. Russian victories made people believe it was easier to fight alongside such a powerful army that was constantly advancing. The illusion on social media was that only Ukrainians were dying. Because those who win don't have fallen soldiers. Only those who lose positions have dead soldiers. The mentality of some treated the war like a video game. The fanatics for an ideology or for the countries that represented them didn't understand the sacrifice of the soldier, much less the suffering of the families who lost contact without knowing the true fate of their loved ones. And in that, the motivations didn't matter. Russian social networks were filled with posts from desperate families, missing information about soldiers, and there was hope that they had been captured or were simply out of contact due to the difficulties at the front. The heart always held on to the thought that they might be alive, maybe suffering in fear in a difficult situation, but alive in the middle of hell.